housekeeping. The Q&A section on today's webinar, we will be taking all your questions there and we will put them to our panel at the end of the presentations. My name is Kevin Gleeson and I am the Innovation Manager in Generation and Trading, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's session on behalf of ESB and MARI. Thank you for joining us and your participation today, and we hope we get many questions in the Q&A session to our panel. We are delighted to be joined by an excellent panel of speakers from MARI. Dr. Paul Dean will present on energy system security of supply, storage and decarbonising the energy system, followed by Professor Jerry Murphy will present on potential roles of hydrogen in hard to abate sectors. And then finally, we have Nathan Gray, who will present on hydrogen business models and a Cork hydrogen cluster. Before I just pass over to Jerry for some additional information and to kick off today's presentations, just want to highlight at ESB, our strategy is driven to make a difference net zero by 2040. While we know wind and solar are going to do the heavy lifting, we see to decarbonise that last part of the energy system, we will need a molecule. And I look forward to hearing about how that molecule can be participate in Ireland's ecosystem today. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Jerry to kickstart off today's proceedings. Over to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Kevin. Just to get this going. Welcome on behalf of the MARI Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine. The MARI Centre has been in place since 2013. We have graduated 220 PhD graduates in that time period. At least 40% have gone into industry, which was an ambition of the centre, that we would create a learned, intelligent, experienced cohort of professionals who would work with industry and lead Ireland to a sustainable, resilient, decarbonised economy and society. The joy of MARI has been working with 109 industry partners, and this is reflective of this project with ESB. A lot of our students have been co-supervised and worked with these industry partners to have industry relevant research. And the centre has been successful in bringing in at this stage about 100 million in research funding. So you're probably aware of lots of our colleagues. Brianna Gallagher is my co-colleague, my co-director, and I'll pass you over now to one of our excellent scientific communicators in Dr. Paul Dean. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope that we were just chatting just before we came online there. I was just saying to Kevin that it's a wonderful day from a webinar. It's a wonderful day for a webinar because it's just miserable outside. So I hope that wherever you are listening to this, that you're safe and well and cozy and warm, and I hope you enjoy what we're going to talk about over the next hour. I just want to set the scene, I suppose, lay out the landscape, I suppose, that we're in at the moment, and how that the contours of that landscape might change into the future. You know, the energy system that we have in the world and in Ireland at the moment is dominated by hydrocarbons, oil and gas. And from a security perspective and from a management perspective, it's a much more forgiving system. It tends to have buffers and line pack and storage. But when we're looking about energy security, the extremes in the system really matter. And today we're going to be talking about extremes in weather, extremes in security, and those extremes are really important, particularly for the electricity system, which doesn't have those buffers that typical hydrocarbon systems do. And when you're talking about extremes, you know, I suppose the bywords for a future energy system in Ireland are flexibility, resilience, and security supply. These are nothing new, by the way. These are the things that are already inherent in our current energy system, which I said again is dominated by hydrocarbons. But these are really fundamental when we think about the future. They shape the future. And in my view, when I think about the electricity system here in Ireland, you know, we've kind of three challenges at the moment: societal challenges with the cost of living, which is driven by the cost of energy; environmental challenges because of the climate pollution that comes with burning natural gas; and also energy security challenges. And those three challenges kind of revolve around one problem. And that problem is natural gas in Ireland, because it's not ours, it's produced by others. its price is precarious and its supply is very, very volatile. And we see the cost of that reliance on natural gas in the prices that we pay for electricity and in home heating. And it's not to vilify natural gas. It's just to accept that that the world of geopolitics is changing, becoming more fractured. And when you're a country like Ireland, who has one of the highest reliances of natural gas in Northwest Europe, within the power system, you kind of become very exposed, and you have to acknowledge that. But changing that is hard. Moving away from natural gas will be tricky. I always say to my researchers that, renewables are great. Renewables like wind and solar are good because they reduce the use of things like conventional natural gas power plants, but they don't replace the need for them. And that's important. This transition away from fossil fuels will take time, and we must maintain security, resilience, and flexibility as we do that. So in the future, for the short to medium term, my view, and maybe even long term, is that we are going to need conventional power plants. But we need to think about how we're going to fuel them differently. And can we do that in clean ways? And that's what we're talking a little bit about today in this webinar as well. From a grid perspective, I suppose for the last 10 years, really, we're defined with the incredible work done by EirGrid and others and the energy regulator. It's thinking about how we're going to get the power system to operate in Ireland with 100% renewable generation, 100% renewable electricity. We're getting there. We're not there yet. But really from 2030 onwards and from now, we need to be thinking about, well, how are we going to operate the same power system with 0% renewables? What happens when there's long periods when there's low meteorological output and the fuel in terms of wind isn't there? And that is really important, again, just to bring back that idea of reliability. And when I think about all of these things, one of the things pops into mind is strategic storage, and it's the seasonal storage. And people say, well, what's the difference between strategic storage and seasonal storage? Seasonal storage and kind of the typical storage that we have within the energy system, within the power system today, is things like, batteries and battery chemistry. And they're really important because they deliver electricity just in time. But we also need strategic storage to deliver energy just in case. What if something goes wrong? What if we get kind of weird weather patterns in the future? And when I think about this and reflect on this, I realize that this is nothing new, actually. We do this already in Ireland. We've been doing this since the 80s and 90s. We store in Ireland today roughly about 1.5 billion euros worth of energy in the form of oil on our island. Okay, now that 1.5 billion, that's the retail value. It fluctuates a little bit depending on the price of oil, etc. So we do this already, and we all pay for it, okay? If you buy petrol or diesel or kerosene, you pay a Nora levy, and we collect roughly around 100 million euros every year to facilitate that. So for me, when I think about the future and security and supply and resilience, and I think about, well, how are we going to do that? And how can we do that with clean energy? We are going to need some form of hydrogen molecule. As Kevin said, the molecule will remain important, particularly around the element of security. And how do we fund that? I think part of that funding is looking at the current structures that we have today and just repurposing it. In 20 years' time or 30 years' time, there's probably not going to be much need for storing 1.5 billion euros worth of oil on the island if we're not using that much. So how can we apply it to clean energy? And I always think that long duration storage shouldn't be seen as an add-on. It's inherent because we do it today. We've been doing it for decades. And what we need now to do it is to repurpose it in the future. Could I have the next slide, please, Jerry? And when we think about the future, part of the work that we do down in UCC, although we like to kind of express it as kind of complex, detailed, and difficult work, but actually, if you're thinking about moving away from fossil fuels and you don't have things like commercially available nuclear and other options, you really have to lean into your renewables. And this is one snapshot of what the future renewable electricity system in Ireland could look like. And while there is uncertainty around some of these numbers, the growth out to 2050, there is no doubt that electricity will be the secure, indigenous, reliable fuel of the future in Ireland because it's ours, it's predictable, it's stable, it's secure, it gives economic, social, environmental, and wider benefits. So these numbers might move around a little bit, but they won't change that much. But there's a problem here. Electricity is great. We can do lots of wonderful things with electricity, but today about 80% of our energy system doesn't have plugs on it. It doesn't use electricity. So we need to put plugs on more things. And as Jerry and Nathan will chat to later on, you can't put a plug on everything. So we have to think about the elements that are hard to abate, things that are hard to convert to electricity, like ships and planes and ferries and all these things. And that's important too. And if I just have my last slide, please, Jerry. And people often say to me, well, Paul, why are we thinking about this now? Why don't we wait till 2040 or 2030 and think about it then. It roughly takes about 20 years to get kind of things done in modern Western democracies like Ireland. If you look at the how long it takes to get storage, if you look at the strategic gas storage that we're thinking about now at the moment, we started thinking about that almost 6 or 7 years ago, and it's still a good bit away from delivery yet. So things take time. And when we move away from a hydrocarbon system, particularly natural gas, you're moving away from the geopolitical risks, but you're trading those geopolitical risks for meteorological risks, because the wind won't always blow in the same way the gas won't always flow. And that's why we're investing in strategic gas storage in Ireland today. So when we think about the future, it's important to think about what role will hydrogen play in some form of long duration, seasonal or strategic energy storage. And for me, I think there's very few options available because current battery chemistry is limited. Current nuclear technology isn't commercially available. Maybe it will in the future, who knows? But we have to deal, I suppose, with the future that we know that's in front of us. So thinking about the longer term storage issue and repurposing the existing storage ideas that we have already are really, really important. Because as I said, the next couple of years for the TSO, for the regulator, is understanding how we can operate our electricity system with 100% renewables. But we mustn't forget that we'll also have to operate it during long periods where there will be low levels of renewables, and we need to start preparing for that now. I'm going to hand over to, I think, back to you now, Jerry, I think, and I hope I've set the scene. And if there's any questions or ideas or conversations we're going to have at the end, I'll be here as well. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you very much, Paul. A very, very nice introduction to a wicked problem. So I'd like to look at the role of hydrogen in hard to abate sectors. And we wrote this report for the International Energy Agency. We looked at circular economy approaches to integration of anaerobic digestion with power to X technologies. And power to X is something that we see as quite important. Paul mentioned that 20% of energy is in the form of electricity. And what I tend to look at, and our research group looks at, is that, as Paul mentioned, it takes about 15 to 20 years to get a big piece of infrastructure in place. So if we start building something in 2026, it's probably going to be close to 2040 when it's built. And there's a huge requirement to decarbonise the hard to abate sectors. And when we look at power to X, when X is equal to 1, we talk about hydrogen. And hydrogen is ubiquitous. And the idea is that all hydrogen produced on the planet now, which is 99% fossil, needs to be renewable. So our offshore wind can split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and we have a molecule that should replace fossil hydrogen. When X is equal to 2, we talk about methane, and about twice the energy is taken from the gas grid than the electricity grid. So we really need to either electrify what natural gas stroke methane does, or find a decarbonised methane molecule. And then we move on, X equal to 3 is methanol. We have a worldwide production of 110 million tonnes. It makes plastics, paints, cosmetics, and fuels. X equal to 4 is ammonia. So when we look at agriculture and emissions from agriculture, and we look at fertilizer, when we put fertilizer on the soil, it's really natural gas, because ammonia, we get that H3 from CH4. We steam methane, reform methane to hydrogen, we get N from the atmosphere, and we make ammonia. And what's quite interesting is that in the Lower Harbour, we produced ammonia when we found natural gas back in the early 80s. So there's no reason why we couldn't go to that 200-acre site in the Lower Harbour, put in an electrolyser and make green ammonia. And again, if we're looking at a lead-in period of 10 to 15 years, we should be doing that now. And another element about the hydrogen molecule, hydrogen is extremely voluminous. It's probably the most voluminous of all these energy gases, and we can convert it to ammonia for export. So if we wanted to make hydrogen in Ireland and export it, we could export it as ammonia. And then we have jet fuel and shipping fuel. And there is a perspective that at the best case scenario, if we were to electrify and decarbonize electricity, the best we could do would be 55% of energy. The other 45% will still be energy, but it will be energy in aviation, in shipping, in fertilizer, in chemicals. So we have a task. We need molecules. So this is a menu that we use in our research group when we try to connect everything in what we would call circular economy, energy and environmental systems. So we're trying to have this cascading, interconnected type system. And so when we look at offshore wind, the ORESS, and I noted yesterday that the North Sea partners agreed that they would have a target of 100 gigawatts of offshore wind in the North Sea by 2030. Ireland is one of those signatures. So it's very, very ambitious and very, very expansive. And if we look at Ireland here, we have all these areas where we may be having wind farms starting on the east coast feeding electricity and then moving south and eventually moving west into floating offshore wind. And we can see over on the right here, phase one is about, I think, about 3 gigawatts. We've now moved down to phase two to Tunnua, which is 0.9 of a gigawatt, but we will have more of these auctioned. And there was an auction pipeline to be auctioned by 2030 of 17 gigawatts of offshore wind. And that's for a country that has rarely used more than 7.5 gigawatts. And we do have challenges in the electricity grid in that this synchronous non-system penetration, in essence, is the ratio of renewable electricity in Ireland to the system demand. And we have one of the highest levels of this in a worldwide basis because we are an island nation. So we do have challenges in having all of this renewable onshore wind, offshore wind, PV in an islanded system. What I find interesting is phase three. It's in the climate action plan as 2 gigawatts of hydrogen. It was in the pipeline as private wire, but there is an expectation that a gigawatt will come into Cork. And this is as to be expected, because if we have all these wind farms off the south of the island, we're not able to take it as electricity up to Dublin. The ability of the wires to take that much electricity is not there. So Cork really would be the centre of molecules and hydrogen, and seeing what we would do in the harbour with a gigawatt of private wire that doesn't enter the national electricity grid. So what do we do in Cork? Do we have data centres? Do we produce hydrogen? Do we produce ammonia? Do we produce methanol? So it's an interesting problem to have. We also look at taking hydrogen onto methane, which we call X equal to 2. And so, for example, just in terms of technology, I would see myself as a biological engineer at this stage. And I spend lots of my time thinking about archaea and bacteria. This is the anaerobic digestion process. We break down complex polymers, we liquefy them, we ferment them, and then we come down to these archaea. And this one, 4.1, is a hydrogenotrophic methanogenic archaea. It's around for millennia. It's around a lot longer than us. And what it does, it reacts 4 moles of hydrogen with a mole of CO2 and makes methane and water. It's an exothermic reaction. The archaea want to do this. It's what they were born to do. So we have designed this bespoke system where we add hydrogen and carbon dioxide into these 3 reactors. Hydrogen is slow to go into solution, so we get it under pressure, we recirculate, and we've run the system in our lab, and we can see, for example, that hydrogen and carbon dioxide start producing methane in reactor 1. So this envelope is the methane diagram. In R2, we get up to 80%, and in R3, we get about 95, 96% methane. And we've done this with varying the flows and intermittent, but we can make methane from hydrogen and carbon dioxide in a process. And you might ask, why would we do it? I suppose one of the reasons is we have a natural gas grid. So we could put the methane into the gas grid and use that facility. It also lends itself to bespoke applications. So this is a wastewater treatment plant outside Copenhagen. It produces 125 meters cubed of biogas from sludge, of which 75 is methane and 50 is CO2. So we can add an ex situ biomethanation and an electrolyzer, and we can convert that CO2 to methane. So we now have 125 meters cubed of methane. It's pure methane. It can be put into a tractor or a truck or the gas grid. So we've upgraded the biogas to pure methane. And we've also increased the amount of methane from 75 meters cubed to 125 meters cubed. What we needed was 4 times the amount of hydrogen as CO2. So that 50 meters cubed of CO2 requires 200 meters cubed of hydrogen, which is 600 kilowatt hours, because hydrogen is 3 kilowatt hours per meter cubed, which is a 1 megawatt electrolyzer. So we can put an electrolyzer at a wastewater treatment plant and convert biogas into pure methane and upgrade biogas. So these are part of our scenarios that we would look at. We've done a lot of work in the MARI Centre with industry, which is quite a large user of energy. So for example, we've worked with Pernod Ricard. We've worked with Pernod Ricard in Middleton and in Paris and in Mexico. And we've been looking at decarbonising the food and beverage sector. So for example, if we were to look at a large distillery like Middleton, I think it's the 4th largest distillery on the planet, and you want to have a net zero alcohol, there are many ways to do it. You electrify as much as you can, but we found we couldn't get beyond 67% decarbonisation without biogas. So you take the byproducts of the distillery and you anaerobically digest them and you replace natural gas. The distillery of itself produces 50,000 tons of biogenic CO2 from fermentation. And if you replace natural gas with biogas, then the stack is also biogenic CO2. And we could take the CO2 from that stack and react with hydrogen and make more methane if we so wish. So we see this food and beverage as a huge element of our circular economy. So for example, if I go down the Lower Harbour in Cork, and we have this gigawatt of private wire coming ashore, I can split water and make hydrogen and oxygen. I could put that electrolyzer at the wastewater treatment plant in Corrigrennan, or I could put it at the ammonia facility in the Lower Harbour. And then we have our biogenic CO2, and the CO2 has to be renewable. So it has to come from biomethane or ethanol or alcohol, and we react the CO2 with the hydrogen and we make methanol. So we're making renewable hydrocarbons. And methanol is a liquid, which is a huge advantage. So we could have tanks of methanol across the country to be used as a dispatchable source of renewable electricity in the form of a molecule. So we've converted electricity to hydrogen and onto a liquid fuel. The biogenic CO2 is really, really important, because if we look at direct air carbon capture, it's about 450 euros a tonne. It's very, very expensive. However, CO2 from a distillery or from biomethane is about 20 euros a tonne. So the cheapest form of biomethanol or renewable hydrocarbons will come when associated with a distillery, with a creamery, with an ethanol plant, or with a biomethane plant. And it's important to know we have a target of 10% substitution of natural gas with biomethane. So we're going to be producing a lot of biomethane for the gas grid, but the CO2 can be used to make renewable hydrocarbons. We can also make ammonia. And again, we could go to the Lower Harbour, put an electrolyzer at the existing facility and make renewable fertilizer, renewable ammonia, and all the uses that would be available for that. We can also make Fischer-Tropsch fuel. So this is what happens at a distillery. They make gases, naphtha, diesel, waxes. The hydrogen can come from an electrolyzer, and the carbon dioxide can come from biomethane or whiskey or food and beverage or ethanol. And this is my last slide. So this is the Celtic Hydrogen Cluster today in the Lower Harbour. So this is a combination of, or a collaboration between Port of Cork, ESB, Gas Networks, Bord Gáis, Simply Blue, Irvine Oil. So again, we're looking at the Lower Harbour in Cork. A gigawatt of private wire comes ashore. We can make hydrogen, we can make hydrogenated vegetable oil, we can make sustainable aviation fuel, we can make renewable ammonia, we can make methanol, we can make e-fuels. So this is very, very exciting, and it brings together the idea that we need renewable fuels. The largest resource of renewable fuels will come from electricity. We're looking at 100 gigawatts of electricity in the North Sea, and we can make fuels that will provide the storage of dispatchable energy that Paul talked about. So I might pass you over now to Nathan Gray. Dr. Nathan Gray is the primary author on this report that looks at the work of ESB and MARI in looking at a business case for hydrogen. Nathan, are you happy to take over?
Yes, thanks very much, Jerry. If you could just go to the next slide. That would be great. Yeah, so thank you, Jerry and Paul and Kevin. My name is Nathan Gray, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at UCC and the MARI Centre. And today I will be presenting an overview of some work we have been doing in collaboration with ESB regarding the potential business models that could be used to help support the development of a hydrogen ecosystem in Ireland. Next slide, please, Jerry. So just to kind of reiterate what Paul and Jerry have already said, there are a number of reasons why developing a hydrogen sector in Ireland is important. And within this work, we have identified kind of 4 main strategic objectives that could be met through the development of an indigenous hydrogen industry in Ireland. The first, as alluded to by Paul, is the need to decarbonise our economy in order to meet ambitious climate targets, especially in related to the hard-to-abate sectors that Jerry covered in his presentation, where direct electrification is challenging. The second then is to enhance our energy security by using hydrogen produced from domestic renewables to lessen our reliance on imported fossil fuels, as well as providing resilience for a future system with high penetrations of electricity from variable renewable sources. The third is then, as a source of flexible demand, electrolysis and hydrogen production can be used as a way to maximize renewable assets by minimizing the amount of energy that would be lost to potential either constraint or curtailment. And then finally, the development of an indigenous hydrogen sector could be used to help create economic opportunities by attracting new industries to the island, who would bring with them high-skilled jobs. So next slide, please. When we think about designing a hydrogen ecosystem, I think it's important to consider the potential end-use applications where hydrogen could be used. If we look at the priority order outlined in the National Hydrogen Strategy, we can see that some end uses are given a higher priority than others, and that, as has kind of already been covered, long duration storage and flexible generation to enhance system resilience is given a very high priority in the strategy. Next animation, Jerry, please. We can also see that as a source of continuous supply or backup for these large energy parks that have been discussed, especially related to data centers, is an area where hydrogen could be seen as a potential route to market. And then if we look at the next animation, as Jerry covered, we're into the aviation and maritime sectors where the low energy density of battery technology presents pretty big, significant challenges. And as an island nation, these sectors are pretty important to us. And this is where we're into the production of e-fuels. But as Jerry highlighted, these fuels may require a sustainable source of CO2, which could be a potential limiting factor. Next animation, please. Another route to market for hydrogen is potentially the production of chemicals or non-energy uses, such as ammonia for fertilizers, or another potential end use is the upgrading of biogas to biomethane to complement the National Biomethane Strategy, which was released in 2024. And then finally, next animation, please. I think it's important to look at the other end of the spectrum as well, and also think about end uses where hydrogen is not seen to be a priority, which includes the likes of domestic heating and blending into the natural gas network. I think it's especially important to consider where hydrogen, where it should be used in the context of support schemes that might use taxpayer or public money, as you don't really want to be incentivizing hydrogen use in sectors where other decarbonisation options are potentially lower cost and more efficient, especially in the likes of the domestic heating sector, where heat pumps are seen as kind of a mature and commercially viable and available technology. Next slide, please, Jerry. In terms of the challenges of developing a hydrogen market in Ireland, in this report, we've identified kind of two major interlinked challenges that face the development of the hydrogen industry in Ireland. The first is, I suppose, categorized as the classic chicken or egg dilemma, and that is in the form of that there are currently a lack of major hydrogen users on the island that could immediately kind of step in and utilize this green hydrogen and act as a baseload level of demand for hydrogen producers. And without this, I suppose, assurance of a route to market for the hydrogen producers may be reluctant to set up in Ireland. Then related to this is also our geographic location. We're an island nation on the western edge of Europe, which means we don't really have easy access to the interconnected energy systems that might be available on the continent in mainland Europe, particularly the widespread European gas network. This is related to the first challenge, as if new sources of domestic demand do not materialize or fail to develop, then hydrogen producers that have set up in Ireland will likely struggle to find a new route to market, as exporting pure hydrogen is a significant technical challenge. To address these issues, in the report, we've looked at a potential two-pronged approach that may be required to stimulate both supply and demand for hydrogen, focusing on attracting new industries to the island, meeting domestic demand, scaling up storage, and producing value-added hydrogen derivatives in the form of methanol or ammonia that are more energy dense and easy to store and transport. Next slide, please, Jerry. If we want to support the development of hydrogen industry in Ireland on the production side of the equation, there are two primary risks that have to be addressed here, namely price and volume risk. Price risk refers to the chance or the risk that the hydrogen production costs are too high for end users to bear, while volume risk refers to the risk that hydrogen producers are unable to sell sufficient quantities to cover their production costs adequately. To mitigate price risk, financial supports would be suggested to be directed towards hydrogen producers as either a fixed or variable premium. In the fixed premium model, which is can be exemplified by the EU Hydrogen Bank, a fixed premium or a fixed amount per unit of hydrogen produced is paid to the hydrogen producer. And this model is generally seen as providing greater certainty, especially for first-of-a-kind projects, but is seen to lack flexibility towards changing market conditions or evolving market conditions. The variable premium model, I suppose, would function quite similarly to the CFD, or the contract for difference mechanism, used to support renewable electricity generation. And this is exemplified in the UK's approach to supporting hydrogen in their hydrogen production business model. And this is generally seen to be more flexible and offer better value for money in terms of support schemes. But the challenge here is setting an appropriate reference price that can be used to benchmark. If we look at the CFDs for electricity, the wholesale electricity market is something that's very well developed and well understood, and therefore using wholesale electricity prices as a benchmark for the reference price is appropriate and quite easy to implement. Whereas for an emerging product like hydrogen, there currently is no wholesale market to benchmark against. So if a variable premium model was to be implemented, one of the things that would have to be considered very carefully is how do you benchmark, or how do you set a reference price for the CFD contract? To cover volume risk for producers, in the UK hydrogen production business model, they have suggested a sliding scale mechanism to be integrated into the price support payment system, where greater levels of support are provided if sales volumes fall below anticipated amounts. So if you've signed a long-term contract with an off-taker, and that off-taker falls through, the amount of payment you get per unit of hydrogen would go up accordingly to help cover your volume risk there. And then the development of, I suppose, large-scale infrastructure in terms of storage is also an option for mitigating volume risk. And this would offer producers a kind of a demand sink where they could send hydrogen that has no other offtake, while also enhancing system resilience. On the other side of the equation, supporting hydrogen utilization is also a way that could be used to mitigate volume risk by helping to ensure that there is sufficient demand to use hydrogen that has been produced. I suppose this can be done in a number of ways, both carrot and stick interventions, with stick interventions such as the ETS or the carbon border adjustment mechanism being implemented to make it more difficult to continue with business as usual practices, or carrot interventions or carrot policies, making it easier for end users to switch to hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives. And then again, just to reiterate, when considering support for hydrogen projects, I think it's very important to bear in mind the priority of hydrogen end uses as set out in the National Hydrogen Strategy, and a potential way to incorporate this would be defining a list of qualifying sectors eligible for support as a way of directing hydrogen use to where it is most needed, and discouraging it from where it's not seen as a priority. Next slide, please, Jerry. So as Jerry kind of covered at the end of his presentation, to kickstart a hydrogen ecosystem in Ireland, the National Hydrogen Strategy suggests initially starting out with a cluster-based approach to hydrogen, where production, storage, and high priority demand are all co-located. I suppose fortuitously, the Cork area here has all three elements of this cluster-based approach, with significant offshore wind potential, large-scale storage available in the depleted Kinsale head gas field, and potential baseload end users for hydrogen, as seen in the Whitegate refinery in the Lower Harbour, or the two power stations that are down there as well. And therefore, we would see Cork as being well situated to being Ireland's first hydrogen cluster, where the support options or business models for supporting a hydrogen industry could potentially be tested and refined before being rolled out to other sites across the country. Next slide, please, Jerry. Just to conclude then, with a broad overview of kind of the steps taken to support the development of a hydrogen ecosystem in Ireland, and the path to maturity. In terms of the near-term goals, the emphasis should probably be on supporting domestic production and supply, scaling up storage for system resilience, and encouraging fuel switching within existing industries to help mitigate price and volume risks for early projects. Once the industry has kind of been established, the next step would probably involve encouraging new industries to relocate to Ireland or set up here to help stimulate further demand and growth in the sector. And then, as kind of an end stage, once domestic demand has been satisfied, there may be potential to explore the market for exports, particularly in the form of higher value-added products such as methanol or ammonia, as this would help spread the costs over a larger pool of customers and potentially help lower prices for Irish users. Next slide, please, Jerry. So then, yes, this is my last slide. I think if you are interested in reading more on this, I would like to direct you towards the white paper we published on this topic called Towards a Low Carbon Hydrogen Ecosystem in Ireland, which was published last year. And I think we will be able to share a link to that to everyone attending today in the follow-up email. So thank you all for listening. I think I'll hand you back over to Kevin now, who will chair the Q&A session. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for your excellent presentation, and to Paul and to Jerry also. So for your questions, I'd like to just direct you to the Q&A at the top of your screen there. And there's a little ask a question. So if you have questions for our panel, I would direct you to there and we will take your questions. And if you like a question, do a thumbs up, please, and we'll kind of rank the questions in order of those as well. As for our panel Q&A session, I'd also like to welcome my colleague Philip Connolly, who is a policy manager in ESB Generation and Trading. So I might ask Tara if you can enable Philip Connolly's mic and camera, and
Sure,
come off mute there. Thank you very much. So Paul nicely set the scene there in terms of our energy system and storage today and the dependence in terms of fossil fuels and how we utilize that today. Jerry, excellent in terms of talking us through the decarbonisation molecules, the pathways, the projects that MARI have been involved in and in other jurisdictions as well, and the options in terms of how we can make and manufacture decarbonised molecules to replace those fossil fuels. And Nathan, thank you very much for taking us through the challenges in terms of developing a hydrogen industry, but also the potential business models and pathways that we could do that from an Irish context. So we have a first question here, just from Orla. So building on the time it takes to develop energy infrastructure and storage today, and what we need by 2040 and 2050 to meet our net zero targets, what can we do now to enable options for our energy system and the broader economy? So I might just pass that firstly to Paul, if that's okay, and then if Jerry, if you want to come in, and Nathan then, and Philip also.
Thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks, Orla. Look, I think the answer is very easy to say, but it's very hard to do. We need to hurry up. Okay, that's simple as it is. We just need to hurry up. I've often said this before, we're not confused or hostages to not knowing what the solutions are. We know what the solutions are. We have the finances and the people in Ireland. We have the know-how. We have the blueprints for the future. We've got the expertise. We've got the knowledge. We've got the technologies. We're just doing it very, very, very slowly. So we need to hurry up. So we need to look at our not only in terms of planning and permitting and construction, but how do we fast track these things? How do we get things done? I think unfortunately in Ireland over the last decade or so, we've kind of forgotten how to build stuff, and unfortunately has bled into the energy system. And look, and it's not taking pot shots at the government here. There's lots of external factors that have amplified those those problems. But it's important to appreciate that we know what to do. We know how to solve the problem. We have the fuel here in terms of our indigenous resources. That is a secure resource. You know, you can't geopolitically interfere with wind. You can't geopolitically interfere with solar, and that's why we need to be, I suppose, brace ourselves and prepare ourselves for these kind of meteorological risks that I spoke about. So. But it's also important to acknowledge that, you know, hurrying things up is hard, okay? And pretending that this stuff is easy will just make it harder. There are trade-offs here, you know, and that is between complete environmental protection and economic progress. And those decisions need to be made. But I do find it very frustrating sometimes, Orla, when you look around at the possibilities that we have in Ireland, and we look at the potential and we look at the ideas, and then when you match that with the pace is just too slow. But as I acknowledge that pointing out that problem is easy, resolving it, I think, will be hard and difficult. Thank you, Orla.
Thanks very much, Paul. Jerry, do you want to add anything to that in terms of the broader economy side?
Yeah, I think as Paul said, I worked as a consulting engineer for 10 years, and when I designed something large, 15 years later, it was built. I think that's really important. I mean, we need our offshore wind. It's a huge amount of work, but we have to think of what happens after the offshore wind. We need to start thinking of, are we going to make ammonia in Cork? Are we going to make methanol in Cork? What are we going to do? And it's a huge challenge, but somebody needs to be doing it. And I do think the industrial park of the future will have hydrogen, will have methanol, will have storage. And I think Cork Harbour is a fantastic test bed. We have the old gas fields. We have a lot of infrastructure. So I think we need to start. I think someone needs to say, the clock is going. What are we going to do with hydrogen? And what will we do with hydrogen?
Thank you very much. Another question here from Catherine Sheridan. How is the water requirement being considered in the nascent hydrogen sector?
I'd like to answer that if I may, Kevin.
Yeah.
Without water, there's no hydrogen. I mean, Ishka Éireann have told us we own hydrogen because we have to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And it's one thing I do worry about, this idea, let's import hydrogen from North Africa. And I met a colleague from Algeria who was saying it's a huge issue in Algeria because water is scarce. And the laws are such that water can only be used for people and crops. So the idea that Algeria will produce all our hydrogen from PV is probably not going to happen. We have been looking at great depth, for example, at Cork main drainage. Carrigrenan, it's a wastewater treatment plant with about 440,000 PE. We've been pyrolyzing digestate from anaerobic digester into biochar. And when we pass wastewater through biochar, we can get potable water of a standard that would be usable by electrolysis. So I do think there's a need for us to look at where we're getting the water from, and ideally not potable water. We need to find wastewater. There's a new recast water directive that requires catenary water treatment, which is basically using activated carbon or graphene. We have the circular economy system where we can make biochar from anaerobic digestion of sludge, and that biochar can upgrade the water to something that can be split. So we need Ishka Éireann. They're essential.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Not for this conversation, but ESB are doing a project with Ishka Éireann and on the utilisation of water, and it's interesting also just to see the options that are there as well from a technology option as well in terms of utilising, as you highlighted there, the wastewater and maximising that option and doing an approach from a circular economy perspective. So another question here from Peter Hart. Does the panel believe that hydrogen will be blended on the existing gas network or confined to clusters, or is a new parallel network required?
I could take that one, Kevin, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I suppose the logic behind the cluster-based approach was to kind of locate production and demand for hydrogen to kind of, at least in the initial stages, bypass the need for transportation or transmission. I think as laid out in the National Hydrogen Strategy, blending is given quite a low priority. I think given you can only blend up to, correct me, I'm open to be corrected here if I'm wrong, but up to 20% in the existing infrastructure, and then that delivers quite a low, I suppose, bang for buck in terms of emissions reduction. If you're looking at then, I suppose, developing a network for hydrogen or a transmission network, that's something that would come probably further down the line in terms of developing a kind of a standalone infrastructure to connect end users and producers that are not co-located. So I think that's kind of the logic behind shooting for a cluster-based approach, at least to start the industry.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Another question in from Ronnie Haw. What do we know about the potential environmental footprint, emissions, extraction impacts from hydrogen clusters, and what do we need to do to close the gaps, and what don't we know yet? So I might Would that
I can
to
jump in there,
Paul
Kevin.
there? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ronnie. Love to hear from you. Look, it's important to remember that hydrogen is indirectly greenhouse gas. That needs to be acknowledged, measured, and minded. But we are fortunate in Ireland when we look at the current managed, if we look at Gas Networks Ireland and their current management of molecules, there's very little leakage. So hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas, but only if it gets out and leaks and touches the atmosphere. So we have a good track record, thankfully, of a competent authority who have limited that with natural gas. But it's an important point that we must remember. This is we often talk about this stuff as being clean, green, and sustainable. Yes, if it's managed correctly. So it's important to acknowledge that and not lose sight of it. So thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you very much for that, Paul, and Ronnie for your question. A question in from Mary O'Byrne. Can you comment on the cost competitiveness of green ammonia or other green end products versus the incumbents? How much of a barrier is this likely to be acceptance and market uptake?
I could talk on that, Kevin. I think what's important is the application of the end product. So, for example, at the moment, we're crafting a paper on renewable maritime fuels, and we're looking at hydrogen, methane, methanol, ammonia, Fischer-Tropsch, and the cheapest fuel to make is hydrogen. And obviously it depends on what you pay for the electricity, but hydrogen is the cheapest of those five to make. But then if you want a ship running on a fuel, you look at the total cost of ownership, and hydrogen is extremely voluminous. So if you put hydrogen on a ship, the total cost of ownership can be 10 times that of marine fuel. What we have looked at is going to methanol, for example, which is a liquid, is a huge saver in the system because you now are putting a liquid on a ship. And we reckon that methanol produced from hydrogen is about 3.5 times more expensive than marine oil. So really, it will never be cheaper. That's not an issue. But the IMO have said that they want, and Nathan might correct me on this, I think it's 30% substitution of marine fuel by 2040. So if you have that level of mandation, you're not competing with marine oil. And at the moment, Maersk are traveling the planet looking for the cheapest source of green methanol they can find. So it will always be more expensive, and it depends on the end use.
Thank you very
I would
much.
suggest that my perspective, and I stand to be corrected, if I was looking for dispatchable storage, I would make methanol as a liquid, and I would have tanks of methanol around the country at data centers that can be converted to electricity when required, as compared to putting hydrogen, which is extremely voluminous, storing it, and then bring it back to make electricity. Again, there are different pathways, but liquid makes things cheaper.
Could I just add a point there, Kevin, please, just to agree with Jerry, actually. I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the cost of a commodity is a relatively small part of the final retail value. It's typically 30 to 40%, and Ireland is an expensive place to do business. Making hydrogen is what we tend to focus a lot on the potential and the price of making hydrogen, but we must move it, we must manage it. And then you have the cost of doing business, wages, salaries, insurance, all these other things. Ireland tends to have a much higher uplift on those non-energy costs than other countries, and that will feed into our competitiveness. So it's not to say I have the answer, but we must be cognizant of those other elements that wrap around the cost of a commodity as well. Having a cheap fuel isn't enough. You need to get it to where it needs to go and a cost that people are willing to pay for it.
Thank you very much for that point. Another question from Neve. Does the panel have any thoughts or comments on the impact and timing of additionality or temporal matching criteria set out in legislation on the cost of renewable power in Ireland, and therefore the cost of RFNBO hydrogen production, which is prohibitive without government incentives? Might the timing of these clauses be pushed out to allow use of renewable power coming out of contract, as an example? Put that to yourself there, Paul. It's
a really hard question, and I don't know the answer. Okay, it's a really tricky one because there's pros and cons. So I'm sorry, I'm going to take a pass on that. As President Trump would say, that's a real wonderful question. That's a real wonderful question, and but unfortunately, I can't. I need to think about it.
No problem.
I can add a little bit there, Kevin, to that one.
Yeah.
I think, like Paul says, I think it is a difficult one. I suppose on the one side you have these additionality and temporal matching criteria set out to ensure that hydrogen is produced sustainably, the emissions impact is as low as possible. But then I think, as Niamh points out, that is a significant barrier to projects starting up, especially small scale or first of a kind projects. So it is something that, we might have to think about in terms of, for large scale hydrogen production, these criteria are needed to ensure that the electricity used is coming from additional deliverable electricity sources that meet the pillars of sustainability. But there might be some flexibility needed for first of a kind demonstration projects to kind of get them off the ground.
If I may quote Rory Monaghan, my good colleague from University of Galway, I've seen this LinkedIn debate, and his perspective is that we've all these electric cars running around on electricity, and everyone says, isn't that great? Now, at the moment, our electricity is 60% fossil, 40% renewable, and electric cars are great. And his perspective is we need to give the same break to hydrogen, because electric cars weren't waiting for all these 467, 300 meter high, 15 megawatt wind turbines. They were given a pass, get the electric cars going. So I think a similar argument could be made for hydrogen, that there should be a starting point from hydrogen, and as the grid becomes greener, then the hydrogen becomes greener. So that argument could be made.
Thanks very much, Sherry and Nathan. A question from James here. Is investing in LNG infrastructure, maybe instead of investing in, for example, hydrogen, going to delay the energy transition or hydrogen deployment in Ireland? Note the pre-legislative scrutiny of the Strategic Gas Emergency Reserve Bill closes this Friday. Thank you, James.
Yeah, I can jump in there, Kevin. No, a good question, James. And I agree with you. There is a risk there, certainly. My view on LNG and on the FSRU unit is that when you look at the exposure that Ireland has in terms of its natural gas supply, the risk is enormous. It would be disastrous if anything happened, physical gas delivery into Ireland for our economy, for society. So my view is that yes, we need an FSRU unit, particularly on home heating. We often talk about electricity, but we have 700,000 homes that need to be heated. And if you can't get gas to those homes, it's very difficult. So we need an FSRU unit. We need it quickly, but we also need to get rid of it quickly. And I would accept your argument there, James, that if there isn't sufficient legislation to make sure that we get rid of that quickly, there is a risk of fossil fuel lock-in. My understanding is that the state is treating it as a strategic storage managed by the government. There does need to be a very clear off-ramp for that unit to as quickly as possible. The best way to do that is move away from natural gas, but that's going to take about 8 to 10 years. The other challenge as well, James, I suppose, that needs to be acknowledged. You can rent an FSRU unit tomorrow. You can't rent a H2 compatible one. So the timing is a challenge there. But I would agree with you on the legislative scrutiny that does need to be watertight. Make sure we get rid of the thing as quickly as possible and start using our own clean indigenous resources. And part of the thing that would help that, James, is our own ability to store some molecule, as Kevin said, on the island. We do it already to the tune of 1.5 billion euros for hydrocarbons. We need to apply the same thinking to clean energy, because that allows us to have security. And when we have security, we can reduce volatility. When you reduce volatility, you take control of prices, and that means you take control of affordability. So it's not just about energy anymore. It's about a whole of society approach, James. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I think that takes us up to time. So apologies for the few questions we didn't get to ask our panel today, but we will look to see if we can send direct contacts back on some of those questions after the session. So without further ado, I'd like to close today's session. I'd like to thank Paul, Jerry and Nathan for their excellent presentations, and also for your answering your questions. Thank everybody who attended today, and also for your engaging questions and for engaging with our panelists today. And finally, just as we close, I would just like to say thank you as well from ESB's perspective And we will be sending out the slides and a link to the report from UCC and ESB later on today. And the session is recorded, and as soon as we do have a recording session live, we will share that out also with those who have registered. Thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.
I'd just like to thank Tara and Aisling and Dee, who this webinar, and Orla, the people who put this together. Great thanks for their time and patience.
No, very much agreed. Like a beautiful swan, we're coasting along and they're doing all the legwork underneath. So thank you very much for everybody. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. And
Thank you.
I'm sure